Welcome to 5-Minute Music. I know I said welcome to 5-minute music, but some of these videos just aren't 5 minutes. I'm excited for this one. So a little while ago I made a video that had a tour of all of my homemade instruments. And I mentioned in that video that there was one instrument that was in the works, and it's this. It is the most beautiful thing we've ever made. So as you can tell, this is a violin. We didn't build this instrument from scratch. We bought an unfinished violin kit. It came with the body of the instrument intact. The neck right here was separate, and it came with a few accessories, a sound post, some strings, and then I bought some other accessories outside of that, and there were a few items that I already had, and I just wanted to take you through the steps that we took to make it and play a little bit on it. And the first thing that we had to do when we started work on the violin was take it apart. So when we got the violin body, there was kind of a gaping hole between the back of the body and this part here. It's often referred to as an open seam, and so we had to use a very thin piece of metal and a little hammer to try to cut this in half. You can actually see very faintly up close this one little area that we accidentally chipped into. And then once we had it in two parts, we looked on the inside and it was a little unrefined. So we did a lot of sanding on the inside. There was nothing inside the violin that really set off a red flag for me, other than these kind of odd brownish, greenish markings on the inside. Almost like there was a little bit of dirt on the wood, but we were able to sand a lot of that cosmetic stuff away on the inside. The hardest part of making this violin was fitting the neck to the body. In order to fit the neck to the body, we needed to shave this part of the body, because you can see the neck goes into the body. So we had to make a cutout about this deep into the violin to fit the neck in. We didn't get a perfect fit, there are some gaps, but to fit it in a way that the neck could just stay in and we could get the right angle of the fingerboard, that was really tricky and very time consuming, especially for people who don't really know what they're doing. A lot of this was really just guesswork, and then we had to drill a hole right up through here and right through here. That way we could attach the button here and attach the neck. And the neck was kind of its own battle. You can see that the neck part here is just a pretty standard size, but we actually did a lot of shaving down using various sanders to get it to a size that I like more. I generally prefer a thinner neck. And then we actually had to take the fingerboard off of the neck using the same process that we did for the rest of the body. They didn't glue it down very well and we just couldn't have that. So we took it off and then re-glued it. And then we had to sand the fingerboard really nicely so that it would be smooth. It's still probably the smoothest part of the instrument. And we stained it with an espresso stain to get it to be kind of darker. They obviously didn't give us an ebony fingerboard, which is what most violin fingerboards are made out of. But this is still a hard wood, it's sturdy, and I do actually like that it's a lighter color. And then here we had to make the peg holes, because the ones that the instrument came with were just really small. They were more pilot holes than anything. And we didn't have any fancy luthier tools like a peg reamer, so we actually ended up just taking a tapered file. We had to find a specific file that matched this particular peg, because violin pegs are conical, meaning that this side is larger than this side. So we found one that matched, and they turned out pretty okay. The pegs do still kind of click when I turn them, which is not a reassuring sound, but they do stay. And then we also attached a little saddle here. Most violin saddles replace the purfling. Purfling is this little line here. The purfling on this particular violin is just cosmetic. It doesn't actually provide any extra protection, and we added just a little tiny piece of wood on top, so that way the tailpiece gut isn't digging into the top of the instrument, it's just digging into the saddle. And so we glued the front part of the violin to the neck, clamped it down, let that dry for a day, and then we glued the back of the violin to the rest of the violin, clamped that down, let that dry for a day. And we did use hide glue, so at least part of this violin is easily removable if we need to. And then some small details. We had to add the grooves at the nut here so that the strings could actually pass through and be spaced apart fairly evenly. We eyeballed it, honestly, but it looks pretty good and it feels comfortable to play. We added a little label on the inside of the violin. It just has my family's name and 2020. So we glued everything together, spent like a day sanding. We had to sand this little bit here to kind of match the curve of the neck better, because originally it was just a square piece of wood. We had to shave off little bits of hide glue that had stuck to the instrument where we didn't want it to be. General sanding so that it would be smooth. And then finally we were ready to stain. So I tried to look up more about the violin varnishing process, and you just hear a number of different things from a number of different people. It was just starting to sound complicated, so we did a ground coat using tea. A ground coat is what gives it the color. We used 4 bags of pomegranate tea. No one really wanted to drink the pomegranate tea, it's kind of gross. We boiled it down, and that didn't give us a color at all. And so I went down to the community gardens, and a lot of flowers at this time of year are kind of dying, so there were a lot of flower petals on the ground. I found a bunch of red petals on the ground, and we mixed those in, and it gave us a really pretty red wine color. So then we coated that onto the violin, and the wood was basically white, keep in mind, and it was looking like this gorgeous sunset color. And then we set it out in the sun to dry for just a few minutes, and it was pink. It was exceptionally pink. And we did a second coat, hoping that another coat would darken it, and it was just pinker. I have nothing against the color pink, but it was not quite the color I was envisioning for this violin. And so we thought coffee grounds. We added some coffee grounds to the mix, strained it, and then we ended up with this color. I'd say it's kind of a rose gold color, and it has a distressed look, I'm told, because our sanding was kind of uneven and we used too high of a grit in some places. And then came finishing. We went to a woodworking store and we asked if they had varnish, and they were like, of course we have varnish. And they took us to 3 cans labeled Marine Spar Varnish. Marine Spar Varnish is intended for like wooden canoes, not necessarily for musical instruments. We weren't feeling great about it, and so we used a finish that we both felt more comfortable with, which was boiled linseed oil, which we used on this. Boiled linseed oil gives it a very faint shine. I'm not sure how much it adds in terms of protection. I'm not sure it really belongs on a violin. I was trying to use Google and see if you could just slather a coat of boiled linseed oil on a violin and call it good, and I read a lot of responses said that would be awful. Do not do that. And so we did that. I had read horror stories of boiled linseed oil soaking into the wood too much and then it takes forever to dry. So we did one very thin coat of boiled linseed oil all around. We let it dry for a couple of days, and then it was ready for the accessories. So the first accessory I put on was the button here. Next were the pegs, and the pegs still don't turn too smoothly, but they do stay. And then I tried to wind the strings into the pegs. That's always just a nightmare. And then I put on the tailpiece. I did the strings up. I used an old set of dominant strings that I had. Eventually the A string broke because I think I swapped the D and the A string. So I had to use an A string of dubious quality. Also, that does lead me to believe that this D string is actually an A string. It certainly has a lot more give than the other strings, but it is a bit odd because we did actually properly measure the strings, and this string was definitely thicker than the A string I had on, but I digress. And then I had to put on the bridge. I had an adventure making these bridges. Basically, after trial and error, I made a bridge, I put it on the violin, and the strings went down the fingerboard like this instead of kind of more of a gentle slant. So then I redid the bridge and it was fine. And then I added this chin rest. This was just an old one that I had that actually matches the instrument. And then we put in the sound post. We do not have the correct tools for inserting and setting a sound post, so we kind of guessed it. We took some bent pieces of wire and we kind of jammed it into place, and then it stuck. It looked like it was pretty upright, and we called that good. After a few weeks of work of asking ourselves, is this an okay thing to do? Can you do this when you're building a violin? We finally ended up with something. I think it makes for a really nice fiddle. It's got kind of this tinnier sound, which isn't quite as suited for this kind of singing classical sound, but for playing fiddle music that makes people feel like they're in an Irish pub, it works. So I'll play some fiddle tunes. I hope you enjoy.